Sir, you're muted.
Sir, your microphone is muted.
Can you hear me now? No, I hope so. It was indeed muted, thanks. I don't know how that happened. Anyway, so if you guys missed anything, I guess just let me know after class and I'll talk about it. So far as the exams are concerned, we haven't talked about anything for you. None of that will be on the exam. But getting back to it. So again, the last thing we just got finished talking about was extra chromosomes, not enough chromosomes, specifically sex chromosomes, right? And before that, we talked about trisomy 21. Now we're going to talk about damaged chromosomes, right? So sometimes there are partial duplications and partial deletions. Very often that is survivable, and very often it leads to physical and or mental abnormalities, going back to Kesterson's question. So, if there was something, again, in this particular question, if that would happen in the sex chromosome, like maybe instead of just having an extra X chromosome, maybe your X chromosome was a little bit larger, or maybe your Y chromosome was a little bit smaller, or vice versa, whatever it may be, right? So that could possibly lead to some of the stuff he was asking about. Then we have something called inversions. I'm not sure I'm going to ask you anything about this, but inversions are when you have a detachment of a chromosome and then a 180 rotation and reinsertion of the part of the chromosome. I guess I'll try to draw that It's going to look like garbage. Actually, you know what? No, I'm not going to try to draw it. There's probably a good textbook picture. I don't remember, because again, this is a new textbook for me. If there's not, and you're curious about it, you can just look it up, right? Google the word genetic inversions or chromosome inversions, and you can see a good picture of it. As a matter of fact, I would assume you can probably find a nice little animation that shows it in action. Anyway, that's one of the things. Another thing is called translocations, and that's where part of chromosomes disassociate and then reattach to different non-homologous chromosomes. And that can be very bad, or it could be harmless, depending on the chromosomes that are affected. So, I'm just throwing out random numbers, because remember, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. So an example of this might be, a chunk of chromosome 1 got snipped off of chromosome number 1 and got added to chromosome number 17. I'm just throwing that out there as an example. So that would be an example of translocation. So basically what we're looking at here is things getting flopped on one chromosome, which is what an inversion is. And then we have translocations where, again, you go from one chromosome to the next. Any questions about this slide? And again, I'll just put a big question mark. I'm not quite sure. Oh, it won't say. Anyway, I'm not quite sure if I'm going to ask those questions on the exam. Any questions? Any questions? Oh wait, there are pictures. I'm sorry. Yeah. So here's pictures from your textbook. I made this PowerPoint, didn't even remember. So this is an example of inversion. So that chunk of the chromosome was kind of like pulled out somehow and flipped and put back in. Then we have this reciprocal translocation. And I didn't even get into that because you don't need to be, we're not, definitely not getting that deep knowing about reciprocal versus other types of translocations. Again, a translocation is when you get a chunk of one chromosome that gets put onto another chromosome. In this particular case, they actually traded. In a weird sense, you can almost think of reciprocal translocations as crossing over. But remember, crossing over is a normal thing and it's on the same chromosome. But here we're dealing with different chromosomes, different homologous chromosomes. So again, as an example, and I'm just throwing numbers out there, this might be chromosome number 1, this might be chromosome number 21, right? So then they swap. So now you have chromosome number 1 with a chromosome number 21 chunk on it. And here you have chromosome number 21 with a chromosome 1 chunk on it. Any questions about that? All right, so at this point, you should be very aware that some things obviously reproduce sexually and asexually. That's been the whole big conversation we've been having for the past couple of weeks. Mitosis versus meiosis. So let's quickly talk about the evolutionary advantages of being asexual versus sexual, because that's the only reason some things are asexual and some things are sexual. And also one of the reasons why some organisms can do either one depending on the situation, right? Many species do reproduce sexually or asexually. And I gave you some examples of that when we first started talking about this. When we talked about mitosis, I gave you examples of like the sea star. Those things are sexually reproducing, but if you cut off the arm of a sea star, or a starfish, however you want to call it, then that arm is going to grow a new starfish, and then the starfish that got an arm cut off of it is going to grow a new arm, right? So let's talk about it. What are the advantages of asexual reproduction? It eliminates the need to expend energy forming gametes and copulating with a partner. And I know that seems weird because in humans, we just live and we're doing okay. But literally, for almost any other organism on Earth, it is a struggle to survive, right? So you want to have the perfect amount of energy spending. Leave it like that because we're going to talk about evolution a little bit later. But yeah, so you don't want to spend extra energy doing that. And not just the energy copulating with a partner, but sometimes copulating with a partner can get you killed. Think about what they talk about. What is the praying mantis? Very often the female will eat the male afterwards. A lot of spiders do that. So yeah, it can be dangerous to have sex. Another thing, and this is, you might think is a bad thing, usually it is, but sometimes this is a good thing. This bullet point right here. Asexual reproduction can reduce genetic variation. Just think about it. You're not mixing genes up. You've got one organism and it clones itself, or asexually reproduces, that makes a perfect copy, right? So then you just have perfect copies, perfect copies, perfect copies. And very often that's a bad thing. Sometimes that's a good thing. When is that good? Well, I'm going to stick with this second bullet point first. If an organism's in a very stable environment that's not changing often, and it's perfectly adapted to that environment, like it's evolved to really take advantage of that environment and thrive in it, then there would be no need. You wouldn't want you wouldn't need this genetic variation. Because you're already perfect, right? So might as well make a perfect copy of this perfect organism. Unlike sexual reproduction, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. But then finally, the other advantage too is when things are sparsely distributed, right? So there are some organisms that just very rarely ever see another organism of the same species. So in that situation, it would have to have asexual reproduction because it can't find anything to copulate with. So any questions about the advantages of asexual reproduction? Okay, well, let's talk about the evolutionary advantages of sexual reproduction. It's basically just the opposite of everything we just said. So again, here we're producing offspring with varied genetic makeup. And that would be good because if you're not in a stable environment, and most environments are not stable, most environments are changing. The temperature changes, the amount of moisture changes, maybe the pH of something that lives in the soil changes, right? All these things change. Therefore, you want to have varied offspring that can survive it. And I use humans as an example, even though humans are bad because we have medicine and ways of surviving when other organisms don't. But think about COVID, for example. Did any of you know anybody who died from COVID? No, that's good. I know a few people. And now I know people all the time get COVID, myself included, and it's just like the flu now. And I don't know if this is 100% true, but this is a good way to think about it. So if it's not true, forgive me. But think about all the genetically varied humans. We're all genetically varied. So when that disease came, some people survived it, some people didn't. And of course, I don't know if it's because they were genetically predisposed and that's why they died. But assuming they did, there you go. That's a good advantage of sexual reproduction. Because imagine if we all had the same genes that the people who died had. Again, I'm oversimplifying because I do know for a fact it wasn't 100% genetic. Some people just had other things going on. But just using that as an example, if we all had the same genetic makeup and it was genetics that killed them, we would all be dead, or at least most of us. So, then again, sorry, one more thing, I'll back up. The evolutionary advantages of sexual reproduction, like I said previously, are basically the opposite of asexual, right? So, yeah, that was good. Never mind, that was a good slide. That told the whole story. So, are there any questions about anything from this chapter before we start the next chapter?
Is that why some people survived the Black Plague back in Europe?
Probably, yeah. I bet it had a lot to do with that. And probably, a lot like COVID too, because again, I was oversimplifying. It's probably a lot of things like comorbidities, previous diseases, especially back then, probably things too like sanitation. I know sanitation was bad back then. I would assume it was worse for poor people. I don't know. What else? Nutrition, especially back then. I mean, now too, we still have people who have better nutrition than others, but especially back then. Great question. Any other questions? All right. Now we can jump into the chapter that I thought we were going to start when we started chapter 7. I was a little bit ahead of myself. I've already downloaded it. But now we're going to get into the genetics chapter. And I personally find this interesting. I hope you do too. Yeah, speaking of which, if you don't find it interesting, and I don't blame you, that's one of my keys to success. I was in K through 12, I had horrible grades. I barely passed, mostly because I was lazy and just didn't do the work. But I learned. Anyway, once I got to college, after the Marines, I was a lot different and thrived in college. And anyway, the advice I was about to give you is, what do they say? Fake it. If you can't fake it till you make it. And that's basically what I'm saying. So what I used to do very often when I took a class and it was boring, I just tried to convince myself that it wasn't. I just tried to get interested in it. So there you go. Anyway, here we go. Chapter 8, Patterns of Inheritance, aka Genetics. We're going to learn about genetics. Once again, I'm borrowing from the old textbook. I like that they have these pictures for the beginning of each chapter, and they have a little thing written about why this particular chapter matters to your everyday life. And I kept it in this case. So let me look at my little notes here. Okay. 4. So for example, can you see what's on this woman's arms? Tattoos, right? So there we go. She has colors and drawings on her arm, right? She has tattoos. Now, when she has kids, are they going to be born with tattoos? No, right? And her hair color, I mean, I don't know this for a fact, but I would assume that's not natural. Do you think any of her kids are going to have that hair color when they're born? Probably not. And what you're going to learn, I'm sure you already know this, but I'm just re-emphasizing this point. So when we talk about genetics and inheritance and later on natural selection and other forms of evolution, it's only the inheritable things that matter, right? So there are ways of modifying your body. Just because you've modified it doesn't mean you're going to pass that down to your offspring. Another advice, it would be better if she was really buff, because then I could say, look how big and muscular she is. And I said, do you think her kids are going to come out big and muscular? Probably not, right? So a lot of things you do to your body are not genetic, right? So you can change your body outside of genetics. It just doesn't matter in the scheme of this chapter. This picture is pretty simple. It's a father with his daughter. Of course, it's a little hard to tell that that's a girl. She's a little baby. But the point there that the old textbook was trying to make is it's the father who determines the sex of the child. So the mother is only offering X chromosomes, as we know from the previous chapter. And the father, when he makes gametes, he has an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. So when he makes sperm, those things separate. So half of his sperms have an X chromosome, half of them have a Y chromosome. And if it's the Y chromosome that fertilizes the egg, he's got a male. If it's the X chromosome that fertilizes the egg, then you got a female. Pretty simple, right? And then this picture, this is really vague, but I guess I just wanted to get a picture of multiple generations. And your textbook was just making your old textbook was just making the point that a lot of diseases are genetic, right? So a lot of the things that are actually killing humans can come from the family. So that obviously would be very relevant in your everyday life, because it would be helpful for you to know the genetic diseases that your family has. Or once you decide, if you ever decide to have children, once you mix with somebody else, you're mixing your genes with theirs, it might be good to know what their family history is and understand the risks involved for your own children. Anyway, those questions on that. This is our little introduction. So let's jump into it. This is another thing that's not in your textbook. This is from the old textbook. I'm not even going to talk about it, but I left it because I thought it's kind of interesting. It talks about like how dogs came to be. If you're interested in that, you can read it. I'm definitely not going to test you on it. But it is very interesting, I think, because it's genetics, so that's relevant. It's also a type of evolution. It's artificial selection, and we're going to learn about that in the next chapter. So, and plus, a lot of people like dogs. So if you're into different dog breeds, take a look at that if you want. Write about it for independent work if you want. All right, another thing to point out is, again, just like the last chapter, I kind of kept the same theme as the old textbook as opposed to the new textbook. So when I'm going through this, it might be in slightly different order than it is in your textbook. But in this case, I really like the old textbook. The old textbook, I thought, did a great job of explaining this, because they kind of do it as a story. Instead of saying, like the last chapter, this is meiosis, this is stage 1 of meiosis, this is stage 2 of meiosis. Kind of boring, right? So the old textbook kind of talks about, gives you the story of how we came to know what we know. So with that in mind, let's jump into it. Actually, I'll give you your next text, or your next word for attendance. I'm pointing at it, just that one, it starts with a G. That's the next word for attendance. And for those of you who are online, you did miss the first word for attendance. So when you send in your words, just say, hey, I was online, and that'll remind me, oh, they didn't get the first word for attendance. You're not going to get penalized because I was too stupid to unmute the mic before I got started. Anyway, that's the next word, so let's get started. Oh, wow. That was a pretty good time. Okay. I'm going to slow it down a little bit. So here's a word you definitely need to know, but I'm almost definitely not going to ask you the vocabulary word, because I'm not too big into that. But you definitely need to know what the word means, because I'm going to use it. Heredity is the transmission of traits from one generation to the next. And once again, this is a great time to remind you, this is from the other textbook. Your textbook might have a slightly different definition, which is once again why I'm not going to ask you the definition. I want you to understand the concept. And also another good time to remind you, this is any bullet point you see here almost is a great independent work topic. Right? You can just look this up and again, question me, question my teachings, question the textbooks. So you can just look it up and say, I looked it up, and you are right. According to this source, the definition of heredity is, right? So you can do that for all this. Question everything. Plus, again, you're going to have different ways of saying the same thing, right? So everybody's brain works different. So maybe that definition up there doesn't work well for you. You might need a different one that clicks for you. All right, the next word you probably definitely need to know, but I'm probably not going to ask you what the word is genetics. So now that we know what heredity is, genetics is just the scientific study of heredity. And again, that's the old textbook definition. I'm not going to ask you the definition. There's probably different ways you could say that. Genetics, the study of genes, right? Is another way you could say it. And what are genes? Well, as you're going to learn a little bit later, it's basically the stuff responsible for heredity, right? So I'm saying the same thing in a different way. Now, like I said, the old textbook says this, kind of tells you this information as a story, so I'm sticking with that. Specifically, the main character in the story, his name is Gregor Mendel. And I'm almost definitely not going to ask you that either. So even though I'm presenting this like a story, this is not a history class, so most likely I'm not going to ask you specific questions like his name or when this happened, which was the 1860s, but let's talk about what he argued from the stuff he had figured out way back in the 1860s. And also trying to keep in mind, I mean, we know a lot about genetics right now, right? So keep in your mind when I'm telling you all this, he's the first. Like, we didn't know any of this stuff that I'm about to teach you. So even though right now a lot of this is probably going to seem really common sense, back then it wasn't. So one of the things he argued was that parents pass their unique genes to offspring. Of course, genes is the new word. He didn't use the word genes. He used the word heritable traits, but same thing, a different word, right? So again, to us, we're like, yeah, of course, that makes sense. We all know, right? I'm sure every one of you knew that your parents passed down the unique genes to you. But back in the day, that was not necessarily a known thing. He also argued that genes were responsible for inherited traits. And once again, he didn't call them genes, but it doesn't matter. Because like I said, I'm not going to ask you questions for the history lesson. But yeah, the heritable traits, mind you. Let's focus on that for a quick second before we move forward. It's genes that are responsible for the inherited traits, right? So not that woman's tattoos, not her hair color, not my daughter's ear piercings, right? If she has kids anytime soon, it's not like they're going to come out with holes in their ears, right? Just because she has it doesn't mean it's heritable. He also argued, and this is the bigger part, and this part's a little bit less obvious too. This is probably the stuff you're going to learn about. I mean, you're going to learn about all this, but the point is, this next bullet point might be new information for you once we dig into it. This particular bullet point will probably make sense, but once we get deeper into it, then that's probably the stuff you may not have known. So genes retain their individual identities generation after generation, no matter how they're mixed up or temporarily masked. For example, I have blue eyes, but both my parents have brown eyes. So for me to have blue eyes, that means both my parents had the version of that gene for blue eyes, but it didn't show up in them, right? So because they had brown eyes. So even though they weren't showing the blue eyes, they had that gene. They had that version of the gene. Otherwise, I wouldn't have had it, right? So that's what it means by no matter how they're mixed up or temporarily masked, right? So that gene that both my parents had to have, that version of that gene, had to have been there, but it was temporarily masked. It didn't disappear. It just, you couldn't see the fact that they had that version of that gene. There's a lot of examples of that. You can look them up for independent work if you want. And obviously, I'm going to give you some once we dig deeper into that bullet point. Are there any questions about this slide before we move forward and talk specifically about what this guy did and how he did it? Okay. I'm actually going to go through some of this stuff quickly and some of it a little bit slower. For example, the next bullet point is an important one, but some later ones aren't so important. And you'll see what I mean when we get there. Mendel studied garden peas. I'm not going to ask you that, but like I said, the old textbook is kind of telling it like a story. So I'm including that too. Why did he choose garden peas? Well, first of all, they're easy to grow. And could you imagine if you were doing genetic study on, a redwood tree? It takes hundreds of years before it's an adult. Like imagine just waiting around, grow 2 trees, and you have to wait years and years and years before you can try to make them reproduce. That wouldn't be easy, right? It wouldn't be easy to grow. Another good thing too is that it comes in many readily distinguishable varieties. So for example, it's not like you're using grass. I mean, I guess if you're into grass, I mean real grass, like this, golf course. I don't know. For me, grass is grass. I couldn't see some two different things. Like, oh yeah, that's clearly this subcategory, right? It's all the same to me anyway. So yeah, pea plants are very different. Or think about like watermelons, for example. Of course, I guess if you're not familiar with them, usually in the grocery store you only get the one variety. But there's a lot of different varieties. Apples, that's a good idea. Or a good, a better analogy. Apples come in a lot of readily distinguishable varieties, right? So that would have been a good one. Of course, apple trees, again, aren't easy to grow as garden peas. But anyway, let me get my little marker out here and put a big X to this. I'm not going to ask you what he studied. I'm not going to ask you why he studied them, so I'm just keeping this because the old textbook did. Here's what I am going to ask you. You definitely need to know the difference between these two for lab. Oh, shoot. You know what? We're doing a DNA lab this week, right? I have to take a look. Hold off on the whole and not coming to lab thing. Sorry. I may have jumped the gun. Because if we're doing the genetics lab, we do need to be here because we're all going to like compare each other's genes and characters and traits, which I'm about to talk about. But I'm pretty sure it's the DNA lab. And if it is the DNA lab, then we're good. I'll look it up today and let you know. Anyway, these two terms you definitely need to know the difference of, and it can get confusing, and I'm not necessarily going to ask you these words on the exam, but I'm going to use them a lot in the exam. So in writing a question, I'm going to use the word character, I'm going to use the word trait, so you need to understand what they mean so you can understand the question. So a character is a heritable feature that varies among individuals. So eye color, since I've already used that as an example, I use that as an example. Eye color is a character. A trait is a variant of a character. So blue eyes is a trait. Green eyes is a trait. Brown eyes is a trait. And the eye color is the character. Everybody understand that? Everybody good there? All right, so it just so happens that each character that Mendel studied with his peas occurred in two distinct traits, which is helpful when you're looking. It's like black and white, right? It's either this or this, which, and I keep using eye color as an example, but technically it's not, right? There's different shades of brown and different shades of blue. But if you oversimplify it, then that would be good. But even then, it's not like there's just blue eyes and brown eyes, right? There's also other colors. So that wouldn't be something that he would have studied because it's not two distinct traits. One that you will get familiar with in either this lab or next week's lab, depending on which one it is. Sorry for not knowing. A chin dimple, for example. You either have a chin dimple or you don't. And having it is the dominant trait, and not having it is a recessive trait. Anyway, so chin dimple would be the character, or yeah, I guess you could say that. And then a trait would be either have it or don't have it. Two distinct varieties. Any questions about this slide? All right. An important advantage of pea plants is that he could strictly control the reproduction. And before I even get started, I'll go ahead and put it next to this. This is just an explanation. I'm not going to ask you any questions about this. But obviously, if you're studying what happens when this thing mates with this thing and you want to see the offspring, you need to be able to control the reproduction. You don't want, this plant mating with this plant without you knowing, because then that's going to mess up your data. So again, this is unimportant, but it's in the old textbook and it might even be in your new one, so I'm keeping it just to say it very quickly. So with pea plants, the petals enclose the egg-producing organ, which is called the carpel, and it also covers in the same pea plant, in the same flower getting covered. It also covers the same, sperm-producing organs, which are called the stamens. And this will make a lot more sense when I show you the picture on the next slide. But consequently, because of this, pea plants usually self-fertilize because the pollen that it produces can just leave the stamen and go directly to the carpel right there. So again, pea plants can self-fertilize, right? These things right here are the male parts. That's the female part. So it can produce the pollen, and then it hits there, and then there you go. It can do that, right? So what he did, and again, I'm not going to ask you any of this. I'm just keeping in line with what was in the textbook. To fertilize one plant with pollen from a different plant, he did it by hand, right? So he would take those flowers and open them up. He would remove the stamens to make sure that thing didn't self-fertilize. And then, as you can see from this picture here, he would take the pollen from one plant and brush it on to the other plant, right? So he knew specifically that this plant was mating with this plant, right? There was no question about it. And once again, I'm not going to ask you any questions about this. if anything, this is almost like saying, and I wish we had time to do this for everything in this class, but instead of me just telling you, this is what we know, right now I'm kind of telling you how we know it. So you can learn a little bit about his process. Because again, like I said, you should question me. You should question your textbook. And if you were, at least now you have one less thing to question. Like, how did he know that they were mating this plant with this plant? Well, there you go. Now you know. Anyway, any questions about all that? Okay, the next slide is important. Here's some terms you definitely need to know. And once again, I'm not sure if I'm going to ask you these words, but I'm going to use them a lot in this chapter and in the exam. So what he did was create purebred varieties of plants. So what is a purebred variety of a plant? It is one that self-fertilizes to produce offspring that are identical to the parent. Actually, you know what? And that might actually be a question. That sounds familiar. So I'll put a question mark next to that. But yes, that is what a purebred variety is. Self-fertilizes to produce an offspring identical to the parent. So once again, when we're talking about those pea plants, since that's the example that we're using for this entire chapter, and again, they only vary in two distinct traits of a particular character, right? So if it had purple flowers, for example, a purebred purple flower would mean no matter what, no matter how you made it with another purebred purple flower, you're always going to get purple flowers. Or the other variety would be a white flower. If it's a purebred variety, then no matter which ones you make with each other, as long as they're purebred, you're always going to end up with an offspring with white flowers. So those are purebreds. Now, when he crossed two different purebreds, then that's where you get something called a hybrid. You definitely need to know what a hybrid is. That is the offspring of two different purebred varieties. So again, in the example I just gave, if you had a purebred white flower plant with a purebred purple flower plant, brought them together, that thing would be called a hybrid. And the verb, that thing, that action of bringing them together is called a genetic cross. That is the cross fertilization that makes hybrids. Of course, technically, anytime you have cross fertilization, no, let's stick with that. I don't want to make it anymore. Don't want to make it confusing. Yes. So again, purebreds. If you get two different purebreds, bring them together, you're going to produce an offspring called a hybrid. And the action of doing that is called a genetic cross. Now, the purebred plants, the first ones that you start working with, those are called the P generation. And you can think of that like P as in paternal or parents. Maybe that'll help you remember. And then their offspring, so the hybrids, that's called the F1 generation. So again, you have two purebred plants, that's the P generation. Bring them together, they have offspring, we call that the F1 generation. And then you can even cross the offspring with each other, and you'll see we do that. And that next generation that they produce is called the F2 generation. So please make sure you understand those concepts. And also, just so you know, this is also very oversimplified. Well, of course, because again, we're talking about what he did, and that was a long time ago. Now we know a lot more about genetics, so now we do a lot more different things. He stuck to stuff that was very, very simple. But I guess my point is, if you start looking into plant breeding for any reason, I don't know why you'd be interested in that. I am, but I guess most other people aren't. If you start looking into that, just know it's probably going to look a lot more complicated than this. This is an oversimplified version. Any questions about this slide?
Does the F1, F2 go further up like the F1000?
Yep, that's what I was saying. Yeah, it gets varied too. Like, so for example, you might have the F1. Maybe you're just studying a set of plants here, and you're studying a set of plants here. So you might mix this F1 with their F1, or you might mix this F1 with their F2. Or sometimes, and again, because this is how it really works, this is an oversimplification. Sometimes you might take the F2 generation and then breed it with a P generation, like go back up the generation, or breed the F2 generation with the F1 generation. So yes, there's all kinds of things that we do in plant science. But again, he was doing, this is the first work, so his is very simple. And to your question, like, I don't know how far it goes. And I don't know if the nomenclature starts changing once you start getting to a lot more generations after the F2 generation.
I know that in the agriculture business that some of the corn seeds that you can buy, it's got numbers as the breed of the corn that you can buy.
There you go. And that, and maybe you have to wonder, is that like some sort of serial number, model number?
Yeah.
Or is it a reflection of which generation it is? That's a good question. good independent work topic if you want to look into it. And I guess the way you can look it up, I guess the best Google search might be, in plant breeding, what comes after the F2 generation? Anyway, that was a good question. Let's go to the next main bullet point. Here we go. So last chapter, I told you, I taught you a concept, and I said this concept is not that difficult to understand. I said the next chapter, I'm going to teach you another concept, and that's going to make things a little bit more complicated because they kind of sound similar. So in the last chapter, I introduced you to the concept called independent assortment. And remember, that's just one saying with the chromosomes, when they line up in the middle of your cells, it's not necessarily like you have all mom chromosomes on one side and all dad chromosomes on the other, right? That's what independent assortment is saying. I was saying that it could be that, but it could also be, I don't know, it varies, right? You could have, it could look like this with moms on one side and dads on the other. Any variety of that, right? That's independent assortment. It's saying when they line up in the middle, they all line up independently of each other. There's nothing that says this side needs to be mom, this side needs to be dad. That's independent assortment. Now to make things more complicated is this thing called Mendel's law of segregation. And I will ask about the law of segregation. And again, when I was a student, it confused me. The concepts are completely different, but the names, to me anyway, sounded similar. Like segregation versus assortment, that was a little bit confusing. So I apologize if it is for you. That's not my intent. I didn't come up with these names. Anyway, Mendel performed experiments, and in these experiments, he tracked the inheritance of certain characters. Remember, a character is like flower color, or in humans, eye color, things like that, and they have different traits. So again, all the characters he looked at in these pea plants either had two alternate traits, two very distinct traits. And the next slide I'll show you is going to help illustrate that idea. And after doing all these experiments, the results led him to formulate several hypotheses. And we'll talk about those, but first let me show you this picture to help visualize what I was talking about. So he wasn't just looking at the character of flower color, or he wasn't just looking at the character of, I don't know, seed color. He looked at all these different characters. And each one of these characters, again, had two distinct varieties. So it's either purple flower or white flower. It's either axial flowers or terminal flowers, which means it's either at the very tip of the plant or not at the very tip of the plant. The seeds were either green or yellow, and never in between. So these are just examples. I'll put a big old X through here too. You don't need to know any of this. The point being, they were very distinct, right? So never did he cross a purple flower and a white flower and get a mix of the two, like a light purple. Never did he cross a yellow seed and a green seed and get a yellowish green, right? It was either yellow or green. Same thing with the pod color. It was either green or yellow, never in between. And that is an important concept. Later that'll be very important. Any questions about that slide? All right. He did something called a monohybrid cross. I know that's hard to read. The monohybrid crosses are something that you will get familiar with in lab, either this week's lab or next week's lab. I think it's this week's. But what is a monohybrid cross? That is a cross between purebred parents that differ in only one character. So again, if he was studying flower color, he'd be like, all right, these plants are exactly the same in every way except the flower color, right? They're the same in the seed color. They're the same in their flower position. Everything's the same except this one thing. They have different flower colors. And then the example I'm just giving you, right? So when he crossed this purebred purple flower with this purebred white flower, remember that's the P generation, and then those had offspring, and that's what we call the F1 generation, he found out that all the plants had purple flowers. So think about that. And this is back in the day when we didn't know anything about genetics. So think about how interesting that must have been to him. No matter how many times he crossed purple and white flowers, every single time, 100% of the time, the offspring always had purple flowers, never white flowers, right? So then the question was, well, did we lose this white gene? Of course, I'm not using the proper terminology. I'll explain that later. But the thing that makes purple flower or white flowers, did it disappear? Because again, 100% of the time, when he crossed purebred purple flowers with white flowers, and he did it thousands of times, every single time, the F1 generation had purple flowers. right? So, and I'll show you an illustration of what I'm talking about. And then the illustration is again, like you're looking at this one flower with this one flower, right? You cross them, and then you have this one flower as the F1 generation. But keep in mind, this is not how it worked. He did this more than once. So first of all, it wasn't just one white flower and one purple flower. He did this thousands of times. And also, when these things reproduce, they have more than one offspring. It's just that this textbook is trying to simplify things. So anyway, 100% of the F1 generation was always purple. So he's wondering, well, what happened to the white flower? Well, why did that disappear? So then he crossed the F1 generation with itself. And then he found out that he got this ratio. About 3/4 of the flowers for the F2 generation were always purple, and about 1/4 were always white. And once again, this is an oversimplification. This one flower probably didn't produce 4 offspring. That one flower probably produced a lot more. And no matter what, no matter how many times you did it, generally speaking, that was the ratio. About 75% purple and 25% white. So at that point, he had figured out that the gene for the white flowers didn't disappear. And then, of course, again, he didn't call it genes. And also there's another word for this that you're going to learn later, but for now, we'll stick with that word. The gene for the white flower didn't disappear. It was just hidden, right? So in that F1 generation, it was just hidden. So he knew then that that meant those F1 generations, the parents, the offspring of those purebred parents, he knew that they had 2 genes, one for a purple flower and one for a white flower. And once again, I'll remind you, he never used the word genes. Technically, genes is also not the correct term to use right now, but I haven't introduced you to the new term, so we're going to stick with genes because that's what we know. So are there any questions so far? Moving right along. So from those experiments and those results, he had 4 hypotheses that you need to know. Actually, he had other ones too. And he also had other results. So I just described one set of experiments he did. He did other experiments too, but again, we're oversimplifying. He had these 4 hypotheses. Number 1, there are alternative versions of genes that account for the variations of inherited characters. Which kind of goes back to that last slide that I just showed you and said, hey, this is technically not the right term. So there wasn't technically a gene for a purple flower and a gene for a white flower. Instead, there's one gene with 2 different versions of the same gene, right? There are alternative versions of genes. That's the first thing. And you definitely need to know that. There are alternative versions of genes. And here's the proper word for it. Like I said, I kept calling them genes. I kept telling you it was incorrect. The proper word, and you definitely need to know this word, is alleles. So an allele, those are different versions of genes. So when we talk about human eye color, it's like, did you get the allele for brown eyes or did you get the allele for blue eyes? When we talk about the allele for chin dimples, like, did you get the allele for a chin dimple or did you get the allele for a smooth dimple, right? Same gene, different versions. Very important concept. That's the first hypothesis. The second hypothesis, for each inherited character, an organism inherits 2 alleles, one from each parent. So keep in mind too, these are his hypotheses. This is an oversimplification. So number 2, everything I'm teaching you is true, but there are exceptions to these rules, and we'll talk about those exceptions later. But yes, it's definitely in what he was looking at for those flowers, or excuse me, those plants, definitely there was one gene for each character, and each gene had 2 different alleles, right? So when those plants inherited one allele from each parent. Here's definitely some words you need to know. An organism that has 2 of the same alleles is called homozygous. Homozygous. Homo, being same. So if I got a purple allele from the mom and a purple allele from the dad, that would be a homozygous individual. If we got a white allele from the mom and a white allele from the dad, that would be a homozygous individual, right? It has 2 identical alleles, 2 of the same versions of those genes. So if that's 2 of the same, and we call that homozygous, any guesses what it would be if the organism had 2 different alleles? Just use some common sense here and look at the prefixes. Yes, perfect, thank you. Heterozygous is the next term, and that is an organism that has two different alleles. You would definitely need to use that in lab. And it even gets a little bit more complicated. We'll talk about that later. So it could be homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, and then heterozygous. But again, we'll make that more complicated later. For now, let's just stick with this. So are there any questions about that? Here's a nice little meme I found. Again, I don't make these. I just found it. Heterozygotes, just a little uneven. I like it. All right, number 3. If two alleles are different, right? So if we're talking about a heterozygous situation, one determines the appearance and one doesn't. The one that it determines the appearance is called dominant, and the one that doesn't is called recessive. So like a purple flower with the dominant, white is recessive. And that's what we'll end off. I guess the last word for attendance would be dominant. And again, I don't make these memes, it's fine. So if there's no questions, I'm gonna go. I've got a lot of grading to do. I'll be online for office hours if you need me. Try to hold off on questions if you can. But if you need me, I'll be there.